The wind howled across the barren plains of Wyoming Territory. 1887, carrying with it the promise of an early winter. Thomas Garrett pulled his worn coat tighter around his shoulders as he surveyed his modest ranch from atop the hill. At 24, he owned 300 acres of stubborn land that fought him at every turn, much like everything else in this unforgiving country. The sun hung low on the horizon, painting the sky in the shades of amber and crimson. Thomas's cattle huddled together near the creek, their breath forming small clouds in the cooling air. He counted them again. 43 head, same as this morning. It wasn't much, but it was his, built from nothing but sweat and determination after his parents died of fever 5 years back. He'd inherited more than land from them. He'd inherited their caution, their distrust of the world beyond their fence posts. His father had been a stern man who believed in keeping to oneself, and his mother, though gentler, had reinforced the lesson that attachments brought nothing but grief. "Keep your heart locked up tight, Tommy," she'd whispered on her deathbed. "This world ain't kind to those who feel too much." Thomas had taken those words to heart. In 5 years of running the ranch, he'd barely spoken to anyone beyond what business required. The other ranchers thought him odd, a young man who didn't drink at the saloon, didn't court the daughters at church socials, didn't even keep company with the working girls when he rode into town for supplies. They whispered about him, called him the hermit behind his back, but Thomas didn't mind. Loneliness was a small price for peace. The afternoon had started clear, but now dark clouds rolled in from the north, moving with unnatural speed. Thomas frowned, recognizing the signs. These weren't ordinary storm clouds. They carried the weight of a blizzard. He'd seen it before, the way the air grew still and heavy, how the birds disappeared, how even the wind seemed to hold its breath before unleashing hell. He spurred his horse, a steady mare named Belle, toward the herd. If he could get them into the eastern valley, they'd have some protection from the worst of it. But as he rode, the temperature plummeted so fast his breath froze in his beard. The first snowflakes fell, large and wet, then smaller and harder, driven horizontal by a wind that seemed to come from all directions at once. Within minutes, he couldn't see Belle's ears in front of him. The world became a white wall of fury. He'd miscalculated, badly. This wasn't just an early storm. This was a killer blizzard, the kind that left cattle frozen standing and men lost 50 feet from their own barn doors. Thomas knew he had to find shelter. The ranch house was at least 3 miles back. Impossible in this weather. Belle stumbled, nearly throwing him, and he realized with growing dread that he'd lost all sense of direction. In the white blindness, every direction looked the same. He gave Belle her head, trusting her instincts more than his own. The mare pushed forward, head low, fighting through drifts that seemed to appear from nowhere. Thomas's hands went numb inside his gloves. Ice formed on his eyelashes, making it hard to keep his eyes open. Just when he thought they were done for, Belle stopped so suddenly he nearly flew over her neck. Through the swirling snow, he caught a glimpse of something, a flicker of orange light. Fire! His frozen mind took a moment to process it. Fire meant people. People meant shelter. He slid off Belle, keeping one hand on her reins, and stumbled toward the light. It came from a small structure tucked against a rocky outcrop, barely visible even 20 feet away. A teepee, he realized with surprise. The conical shape was unmistakable, though he'd never seen one this far from the reservation. Thomas hesitated. Indians. His father's voice echoed in his memory. "Can't trust 'em, son. They smile at your face and put a knife in your back." But the cold was a knife already, cutting through his coat, his skin, into his very bones. Pride and prejudice were luxuries he couldn't afford. He approached the entrance, a flap of hide that glowed from the fire within. His frozen fingers fumbled as he knocked on the wooden pole beside it, a courtesy his mother had taught him. "Always announce yourself," she'd said. "Manners matter, even at the edge of the world." "Hello?" His voice came out as a croak. "I'm sorry to bother. I'm caught in the storm." The flap pulled aside, and Thomas found himself looking into dark eyes that held both wariness and surprise. A young woman stood there, perhaps 20 years old, with long black hair braided down her back. Behind her, another woman, slightly older, rose from beside the fire. Both wore traditional dress, soft doeskin decorated with beadwork that caught the firelight. For a long moment, they stared at each other. Thomas knew what they saw. A white man, armed, at their door. He could see their tension, the way the older one's hand moved to something at her belt, a knife. Probably. He couldn't blame them. The treaties meant nothing out here. White men had given them plenty of reasons for distrust. "Please," he said, his teeth chattering so hard he could barely speak. "My horse. We're lost. I mean no harm." The younger woman looked back at her companion. Her sister. Thomas guessed, seeing the resemblance. They exchanged words in their own language, quick and low. Then the older one nodded slightly. "Come," the younger woman said in accented English. "Bring horse." Thomas nearly wept with relief. He tugged Belle forward, and the women showed him where to tie her on the lee side of the teepee, somewhat protected from the worst of the wind. His fingers were too numb to work the knots. And without a word, the older sister took over, her hands quick and efficient. Inside the teepee, the warmth hit him like a physical blow. A small fire burned in the center, smoke rising through the opening at the peak. Buffalo robes and blankets created a cozy circle around the flames. The space smelled of smoke, leather, and something else, herbs, maybe, or tea brewing in a pot near the coals. Thomas stood awkwardly near the entrance, dripping melting snow, unsure of the protocol. The younger woman gestured to a spot near the fire. "Sit, you freeze standing there." He collapsed more than sat, his legs suddenly unable to hold him. The older sister studied him with intelligent eyes, then said something to her sister, who nodded and began preparing something in a small clay pot. I'm Thomas Garrett," he managed. "I have a ranch about 3 miles south, or at least I think it's south. Hard to tell in the storm." "I am Mary," the younger woman said, surprising him with a Christian name. "This my sister, Sarah." Mary, Sarah, not the names he'd expected. He must have shown his surprise because Mary smiled slightly. "Mission school," she explained. "They give us new names, say our real name's too hard for white tongues." There was no bitterness in her voice, just matter-of-fact acceptance. Sarah handed him a cup of something hot. The ceramic burned his frozen fingers, but he held on, letting the heat seep into his bones. The first sip made him cough. It was strong, bitter, with an aftertaste of pine and something earthy. "Medicine tea," Mary said. "Warm you inside." As feeling returned to his extremities, pain came with it. His fingers and toes burned as if held to hot coals. He must have shown it on his face because Sarah spoke for the first time. "Pain is good, means no frostbite, drink more." They moved around him with quiet efficiency, hanging his wet coat near the fire, offering him a blanket for his shoulders. Their kindness confused him. Everything he'd been taught said Indians were savage, cruel, not to be trusted. But here were 2 young women sharing their shelter, their medicine, their warmth, with a stranger who represented everything that had been taken from their people. "Why?" he asked suddenly. "Why help me? He gestured vaguely at himself, unable to finish. Mary and Sarah exchanged glances again. Then Mary sat across from him, her face serious in the firelight. "Storm does not care if you white or Apache. Cold kills all same. We know what it means to need shelter." The wind rattled the tippy walls, but inside, the fire crackled peacefully. Thomas found himself relaxing for the first time in, he couldn't remember how long. The tea was working its magic, warmth spreading from his belly outward. "You live here?" he asked, then immediately felt foolish. Obviously they lived here. "For now," Sarah said. "We move with seasons. Winter come early this year. Are you alone?" The question slipped out before he could stop it. 2 women alone on the frontier seemed dangerous, regardless of race. Mary's expression hardened slightly. "Our men are gone. Soldiers take them to reservation. She paused, choosing words carefully. We choose different path. Thomas understood. They were fugitives, in a way, living free but illegal, hiding from the authorities who would force them onto the reservation. He should report them. It was the law, but looking at their faces in the firelight, seeing the dignity they maintained despite everything, he knew he wouldn't. The storm raged on outside, but inside the teepee, an unexpected peace descended. Thomas found himself talking, really talking, for the first time in years. He told them about the ranch, about the cattle he hoped survived the storm, about the endless work and isolation. They listened without judgment, occasionally asking questions that showed they understood more about ranching than he'd expected. You have no woman? Sarah asked eventually. No children? Thomas felt heat rise to his face that had nothing to do with the fire. No, I keep to myself. Mary tilted her head, studying him with those penetrating dark eyes. Young man with land, cattle. White women must want you for husband. I haven't. He stopped, frustrated by his inability to explain. How could he tell them that he'd never even kissed a woman? That the thought of courtship, of opening his heart to another person, terrified him more than any blizzard. But somehow, they seemed to understand without words. Sarah poured more tea, and Mary added another log to the fire. They didn't press, didn't tease, just accepted his awkwardness as they'd accepted his presence, with a grace he didn't deserve. As the night deepened and the storm showed no signs of abating, Thomas realized something had shifted inside him. For the first time in 5 years, he didn't feel alone. These two women, who should have been his enemies according to everything he'd been taught, had shown him more genuine warmth than he'd experienced since his mother's death. Thank you, he said quietly. For the shelter, the tea, He gestured helplessly. Unable to articulate what he meant, Mary smiled, and it transformed her face from merely pretty to beautiful. A virgin rancher took shelter with 2 Apache sisters, she said, her eyes twinkling with mischief. This night will change him forever. Thomas choked on his tea. I'm not... How did you... Sarah laughed, a sound like wind chimes. We have eyes. We see man who does not know women. Is nothing shameful. But Thomas felt the shame anyway, burning hotter than the fire. Here he was, supposed to be the superior one, the civilized one. Yet these women saw through him completely, saw his inexperience, his fear, his loneliness, and still offered him shelter. The wind howled louder, and the tippy walls shuddered. But inside, wrapped in warmth and unexpected acceptance, Thomas Garrett began to feel something he'd thought lost forever. The possibility of connection, of understanding, of a life beyond mere survival. As the fire burned low and his eyelids grew heavy, he thought he heard his mother's voice on the wind. But this time, instead of warning him to lock his heart away, she seemed to whisper, Sometimes, Tommy, the greatest courage is in learning to trust. The first thing Thomas noticed when he woke was the silence. The howling wind that had driven him to shelter had died to a whisper. Gray morning light filtered through the smoke hole above, casting the interior of the teepee in soft shadows. The fire had burned low, just embers glowing beneath white ash. He lay still for a moment, disoriented. The events of the previous night seemed almost dreamlike. The blizzard, the desperate search for shelter, the unexpected warmth of the 2 Apache women who had taken him in. But the smell of smoke and leather, the soft breathing from across the fire pit, told him it was real. Mary sat near the entrance, working on something with her hands. Beadwork, he realized, watching her fingers move with practiced precision. Sarah was nowhere to be seen. When Mary noticed he was awake, she set aside her work. Storm passed, she said simply. Your horse is well. Thomas sat up, his body stiff from sleeping on the ground, though the buffalo robes had been more comfortable than he'd expected. I should go, he said, though something in him resisted the idea. Check on my cattle. Mary nodded, but made no move to hurry him. Instead, she reached for a pot near the fire. Eat first. Long ride in snow. She handed him a wooden bowl filled with something that looked like porridge but smelled of sage and wild onions. His stomach growled, reminding him he hadn't eaten since yesterday morning. The first spoonful was surprisingly good, hearty and warming, with chunks of what might have been rabbit meat. "This is good," he said, meaning it. "Thank you." A small smile touched her lips. "White men usually don't like our food. White men are fools," he said without thinking, then flushed at his own words. Mary's smile widened. "Sometimes yes, sometimes no. You not fool. I think, just—" She searched for the word. "Lonely." The accuracy of her observation made him uncomfortable. He focused on eating. But she wasn't done. "Why you live alone? Your parents gone?" "Fever took them 5 years ago." "No brothers? Sisters?" He shook his head. "Just me." "Is hard. Being alone. We know this." Her voice carried a weight of experience beyond her years. "Sarah and me, we have only each other now. Father killed at Sand Creek. Mother died of sickness after. Brothers taken to reservation." Thomas knew about Sand Creek. Everyone did. The massacre that had turned even some white folks' stomachs. He didn't know what to say, so he said nothing. Sarah entered then, carrying an armload of wood, snow dusting her hair. She spoke to Mary in Apache, her tone questioning. Mary responded, and Sarah's eyebrows rose. She studied Thomas with those penetrating dark eyes, then said something that made Mary laugh. "What?" Thomas asked. Suspicious. "She says you look less like frozen rabbit this morning," Mary translated. "More like nervous deer," despite himself. Thomas smiled. It felt strange on his face, like using muscles that had atrophied. "Nervous deer is probably accurate." Sarah set down the wood and came to sit by the fire. Up close, Thomas could see she was older than he'd first thought, maybe 25 to Mary's 20. There were lines around her eyes, the kind that came from squinting into sun and wind, and from harder things too. "You have woman waiting?" Sarah asked bluntly. "Wonder where you are?" "No," Thomas said, then felt compelled to add, "No one wonders where I am, most days." The sisters exchanged one of their meaningful looks. Then Mary rose gracefully. "Come, we show you something." Curious, Thomas followed them outside. The world had transformed overnight. Snow lay thick and pristine, turning the harsh landscape into something almost magical. The sun was breaking through clouds, making everything sparkle. But what caught his attention was their shelter itself. He'd been too desperate last night to really look, but now he saw how cleverly it was positioned, protected by the rock outcrop, angled to deflect wind, near a small spring that gurgled beneath a thin sheet of ice. This wasn't a temporary camp. They'd been here a while. "You built this?" he asked, impressed. "Apache women build homes," Sarah said with quiet pride. "Men hunt, fight. Women make life possible." She showed him their food cache, carefully hidden and protected from animals. Mary pointed out the herbs growing in sheltered spots, explaining their uses, this one for fever, that one for wounds, another to keep meat from spoiling. Thomas found himself fascinated. His mother had known some plant medicine, but nothing like this. "How do you remember it all?" he asked. "Mother teach daughter. Grandmother teach mother," Mary explained. "Goes back forever. White man's schools try to make us forget, but—" She tapped her temple. "Some things too deep to forget." They were circling back to the teepee when Sarah suddenly stopped, her body tense. She said something sharp in Apache, and Mary's hand went to the knife at her belt. Thomas followed their gaze and saw riders in the distance. 3 men, moving slowly through the snow. "Get inside," Sarah ordered. "Now!" But Thomas recognized the lead rider's yellow coat. "Wait, that's Jim Henderson. He has the ranch north of mine. They must be looking for survivors from the storm." The women relaxed marginally but didn't lower their guard. Thomas understood their caution. 3 white men finding 2 Apache women alone could go bad quickly. "I'll talk to them," he said. "Tell them I sheltered here. They won't cause trouble if I'm here." Sarah looked skeptical, but Mary nodded. We trust you. Those 3 words hit him unexpectedly hard. When was the last time anyone had trusted him with anything important? The riders approached slowly, horses struggling through the deep snow. Jim Henderson was indeed in the lead, followed by his son Pete and their hired hand, a mean-spirited man named Dobbs, who Thomas had never liked. "Garrett!" "Chum," Jim called out when they were within earshot. "Christ almighty! Boy! We thought you were frozen dead for sure." "Nearly was," Thomas replied, moving to meet them before they got too close to the teepee. "Found shelter just in time." Pete's eyes had fixed on the teepee, and more specifically, on Mary and Sarah standing near its entrance. Well, what have we here?" "The ladies were kind enough to share their shelter," Thomas said firmly. "I owe them my life." Dobbs spit tobacco juice into the snow. "Apache squaws. Looks like ain't supposed to be off the reservation." "Storm didn't care about reservations," Thomas said, keeping his voice level. "Neither did their kindness." Jim was studying the situation with shrewd eyes. He was a decent man, mostly, but Thomas could see him weighing options. 2 Apache women alone, no men in sight. The reservation boundaries were a good 50 miles away. "You know I have to report this," Jim said finally. "It's the law." "You know what happens to women sent to the reservation alone," Thomas countered. "Is that Christian?" Pete laughed, an ugly sound. "Since when do you care about squaws?" "Garrett? Hell, since when do you care about any woman? We all figured you preferred sheep." The insult was meant to provoke, and it worked. Thomas felt rage rise in his chest, hot and unfamiliar. But before he could respond, Mary stepped forward. "We save his life," she said clearly. "Fed him, kept him warm. This how white men repay kindness. Nobody asked your opinion, girl." Dobbs growled. "I'm asking it," Thomas said, surprising everyone, including himself. "And I'm telling you all to move along. Nothing to report here." The atmosphere shifted, became dangerous. Thomas had never challenged anyone before, certainly not 3 armed men. His hand moved instinctively toward his gun, then stopped. Violence wouldn't help here. Jim studied him for a long moment. "This ain't like you, Thomas. These women got some hold on you?" "They showed me decency," Thomas said simply. "I aim to return it. By breaking the law. By doing what's right." Sarah had moved up beside her sister, both women ready for whatever came next. Thomas saw Dobbs's hand drift toward his rifle and tensed. Then Jim sighed. "Hell, I didn't see nothing out here but snow and more snow. You boys see anything?" Pete looked ready to argue, but his father's look silenced him. Dobbs just glared. "Thought not," Jim continued. "Come on, boys. Let's check the southern pastures." He turned his horse, then looked back at Thomas. "You be careful, son. This kind of thing. It can go bad for everyone involved." After they left, Thomas found himself shaking. Not from cold or fear, but from something else. He'd stood up to them. He'd chosen a side. And it wasn't the one he'd been raised to choose. "Why?" Sarah asked. "Why you risk for us?" Thomas looked at the 2 women who had taken in a stranger, who lived with daily danger just for the crime of being free. "Because it was right," he said. "Because you trusted me." Mary smiled, that transformative expression that made his heart do strange things. "Come, tea is ready." Back inside the teepee, the atmosphere was different. The caution was still there, but underneath it, something warmer. Sarah actually smiled at him as she poured the tea. Mary sat closer than before, close enough that he could smell the sage smoke in her hair. "You should go soon," Sarah said, but her tone was gentler now. "Check your cattle, before more men come looking." Thomas knew she was right, but leaving felt wrong. In less than a day, these women had shown him more genuine human connection than he'd experienced in years. The thought of returning to his empty house, his silent meals, his cold bed, filled him with dread. "Could I—" He stopped, gathered courage. "Could I come back? Bring supplies, maybe payment for your kindness?" The sisters consulted silently. Then Mary nodded. "You know where to find us. But Thomas—" She paused, choosing words carefully. "This is dangerous. For you. For us. You understand." He understood. A white man visiting Apache women, bringing them supplies, protecting them from the law. It would destroy his reputation at best. At worst, it could get them all killed. "I understand," he said. "But I want to help, if you'll let me." Sarah reached out suddenly and touched his hand. Her fingers were calloused but gentle. "Lonely, dear," she said softly. "Maybe not so lonely now." As Thomas prepared to leave, checking on Belle and gathering his still damp coat, he felt something fundamental shifting inside him. The walls he'd built around his heart, brick by brick over 5 lonely years, were beginning to crack. Mary walked him to where Belle waited. "That night changed him forever," she said, echoing her words from the night before. But now there was something else in her voice, something that made his pulse quicken. "It's not night anymore," he pointed out. She smiled. "No, now is morning. New beginning, maybe." As he mounted Belle and turned toward home, Thomas looked back once. The 2 women stood together, dark figures against the white snow, watching him go. He raised his hand in farewell, and they waved back. The ride home was cold, but his heart was warm. For the first time in 5 years, Thomas Garrett had something to look forward to, something more than mere survival. He thought of Jim Henderson's warning, of the dangers ahead. But stronger than fear was this new feeling, a connection to something beyond himself. 2 Apache women had offered him shelter from more than just the storm. They'd offered him a chance at a different life. As his ranch came into view, Thomas made a decision. He would go back. He would bring supplies, and maybe, if they'd let him, he would learn what it meant to not be alone. The lonely deer had found something worth the risk. Thomas stared at the coffee growing cold in his hands. Seated at the rough wooden table his father had built 20 years ago. 3 days had passed since the storm, since the night that had cracked something open inside him. The ranch house felt emptier than ever, its silence oppressive rather than peaceful. He'd lost 4 cattle to the blizzard, found them frozen standing in the north pasture like statues. It was a blow he could ill afford, but strangely, the loss barely registered. His mind kept drifting back to the teepee, to dark eyes reflecting firelight, to gentle hands offering tea and unexpected understanding. "What's wrong with you?" he muttered to himself, pushing back from the table. But he knew what was wrong, or perhaps what was finally right. That afternoon, he loaded his pack horse with supplies: flour, salt, coffee, a haunch of venison from a deer he'd shot yesterday. He added blankets, unsure if they needed them, but wanting to contribute something. At the last moment, he included a small packet of sugar, a luxury even for himself. He remembered Mary's tea and wondered if she'd ever tasted sweetened coffee. The ride to their camp felt both eternal and too brief. His heart hammered as the rock outcrop came into view. Half afraid he'd find them gone, moved on like smoke in the wind. But the tipi stood where he'd left it, and relief flooded through him so strongly it made him dizzy. Mary emerged as he approached, as if she'd been watching for him. She wore the same doeskin dress, but had added a colorful woven shawl against the cold. Her face showed surprise, then something that might have been pleasure. "Thomas," she said simply, "you came back." "I said I would." He dismounted, suddenly awkward. "I brought supplies." "To repay your kindness." Sarah appeared from behind the teepee, carrying a freshly cleaned rabbit. She looked at the loaded pack horse, then at Thomas, her expression unreadable. "You risked much, coming here. You risked more, taking me in." The 2 women helped him unload the supplies, exclaiming softly over the sugar, running their hands over the wool blankets. It was clear they'd been making do with very little, too proud to beg, too stubborn to surrender to the reservation. "Stay," Mary said as he prepared to leave. "Eat with us. Tell us about your ranch." He knew he should go. Every moment here increased the danger for all of them, but the thought of returning to his empty house was unbearable. "If you're sure." Over the next weeks, Thomas fell into a pattern that would have shocked his former self. 3 times a week, sometimes 4. He would find reasons to ride to the teepee. He brought supplies, yes, but also stories, questions, an eager ear for their own tales. He learned their real names, i.e. Yana and Nashota, though they asked him to continue using their Christian names for safety. I.e. Yana means eternal blossom. Mary told him one afternoon as she showed him how to set snares for rabbits. But Mary is easier for white tongues. I could learn, Thomas offered, if you'd teach me. She looked at him with those dark, knowing eyes. Some things are better kept hidden, safer. He learned that Sarah had been married once, to a warrior killed in the army's last sweep through the territory. She wore her grief like armor, sharp-edged and protective. Mary had been promised to a man she'd never met, but the massacre at Sand Creek had ended that future along with so many others. So, we choose our own path, Sarah said firmly. No man decides for us now. Thomas found himself telling them things he'd never spoken aloud, about his father's harsh lessons in manhood, his mother's gentle attempts to soften those edges, about the fear that had gripped him after their deaths, the way he'd retreated into himself like a wounded animal. My father said women make men weak, he confessed one evening as they sat around the fire. Said they distract from what needs doing. Mary laughed, not unkindly. Your father never met Apache women. We make men stronger, if they're smart enough to see it. I think, Thomas said slowly. He was afraid, of feeling too much, of losing control. Sarah nodded. Fear makes men say foolish things, do foolish things too. As winter deepened, Thomas found himself changing in ways that both thrilled and terrified him. The rigid control he'd maintained for so long was melting like spring snow. He caught himself humming while working, something he hadn't done since childhood. Food tasted better. The sunrise seemed more beautiful. Even the cold felt less bitter. One afternoon, he arrived to find Mary alone. Sarah had gone to check their trap lines, she explained. They sat by the fire, closer than usual, and Thomas felt that new familiar flutter in his chest. You're different now, Mary observed. Less like scared rabbit, more like nervous deer, he asked, remembering Sarah's words. No. She reached out and touched his hand, sending sparks through his entire body. More like man finding his heart. Thomas turned his hand over, catching her fingers gently. They sat that way for a long moment, the touch saying things words couldn't. He'd never held a woman's hand before, never understood how such a simple connection could feel so profound. I've never, he started, then stopped, flushing. I know, Mary said softly. Is okay. Some men touch many women but never feel. You feel first, is better way. I don't know what I'm doing, he admitted. Any of it, being here, feeling. It goes against everything I was taught. Good teaching helps us live. Bad teaching keeps us from living. She squeezed his hand. Which is this? Before he could answer, they heard Sarah returning. Mary withdrew her hand naturally, without shame or haste, but something had shifted between them. A line crossed that couldn't be uncrossed. That night, riding home under stars sharp as glass, Thomas wrestled with revelations. He was falling in love. The virgin rancher who'd never even courted a woman was falling for an Apache woman who, by all rights and laws and social conventions, should be his enemy. His father would be horrified. The neighbors would be scandalized. It could cost him everything, his reputation, his ranch, maybe his life. And yet, for the first time since his parents died, Thomas felt truly alive. He thought about Mary's question, good teaching or bad? The answer seemed obvious now. Any teaching that kept him from this feeling, from this connection, was teaching worth abandoning. But knowledge and action were different things. Back at his ranch, staring at his reflection in the small mirror by the wash basin, Thomas saw a man caught between worlds. The beard needed trimming. His hair had grown shaggy. But it was his eyes that showed the most change. No longer flat and distant, but alive with possibility and fear. What are you doing? He asked his reflection. Where does this lead? The reflection had no answers, but Thomas knew he would return tomorrow, and the day after, and all the days following. Whatever the cost, whatever the consequences, he couldn't turn away from the warmth he'd found in that teepee. He thought of his mother's deathbed words about keeping his heart locked up tight. "I'm sorry, Ma," he whispered to the empty room. "But maybe you were wrong. Maybe the world's cruelty is exactly why we need to feel too much, not too little." Outside, wind rattled the windows, but it no longer sounded lonely. It sounded like invitation, like promise, like the future calling him towards something worth the risk. The next morning, Thomas woke with new purpose at the general store in town. He bought coffee and tea, ammunition for hunting, and, after long hesitation, a small hand mirror with a decorated wooden handle. It was frivolous, expensive, the kind of thing that would mark him as sweet on someone if anyone noticed. Old Sam, who ran the store, raised his eyebrows at the purchase. "Got a sweetheart, Thomas? About time, boy." Thomas mumbled something noncommittal and fled, but he couldn't stop the smile that spread across his face. A sweetheart. The word felt foreign and wonderful. When he presented the mirror to Mary that afternoon, her face lit up like sunrise. She turned it this way and that, catching the light, then looked at him with eyes bright with emotion. "No one ever gave me gift before," she said quietly. "Not like this. Not just because." "It's nothing," Thomas said, embarrassed by her reaction. "Just thought you might like it." Sarah, watching from across the fire, smiled knowingly. "Nervous deer becomes brave deer." She said, "Good." That night, they taught him words in their language, simple things like water and fire and friend. His tongue stumbled over the unfamiliar sounds, making them laugh. But when Mary corrected his pronunciation, leaning close, her breath warm on his cheek, he felt that same electric connection that was becoming his new constant. "Some words can't translate," she said. "Like this," she spoke a phrase in Apache, musical and complex. "What does it mean?" She and Sarah exchanged glances. "Is about feeling," Mary said finally. "When heart recognizes another heart, when souls say hello." Thomas repeated the phrase, mangling it terribly. But Mary smiled and nodded. "Yes, like that." As he prepared to leave, Sarah pulled him aside. Her usual stern expression was softer, almost maternal. "You're good, man," she said quietly. "But this path, you know where it leads." "No," Thomas admitted. "I just know I have to walk it." Sarah studied him for a long moment. "Mary has gentle heart. Already wounded once. If you hurt her—" "I won't," Thomas said quickly. "I'd never, not on purpose, but your world, our world." She gestured helplessly. "Oil and water, maybe," Thomas said. "Or maybe just two people trying to find their way." Sarah sighed. "Young hearts don't listen to wisdom anyway. Just be careful, both of you." Riding home, Thomas reflected on Sarah's warning. She was right, of course. This path led nowhere good by any conventional measure. But conventional had gotten him 5 years of empty existence. Maybe it was time to try impossible instead. The virgin rancher was learning that innocence wasn't just about physical experience. It was about emotional walls, about the safety of isolation, about the careful constructions that kept the world at arm's length. And once those walls started falling, there was no stopping the avalanche. That night changed him forever. Mary had said she was right, but it wasn't the single night. It was all the nights and days that followed, each one stripping away another layer of fear, revealing the man underneath who was capable of so much more than mere survival. The February sun had no warmth, but Thomas barely felt the cold as he worked to repair the tipee's entrance flap. His hands, once clumsy with anything delicate, now moved with practiced ease as he threaded sinew through leather. Mary watched from nearby, ostensibly working on her beadwork, but stealing glances at him with a soft expression that made his heart race. 3 months had passed since that first desperate night. The snow lay thick still, but paths had been worn between his ranch and their camp. Thomas had learned to move through the woods like a shadow, varying his routes, always watching for other riders. He'd become part of their hidden world, and it had transformed him. "You're getting better," Sarah observed, checking his work. "Soon you won't need us to teach you." "I'll always need—" Thomas caught himself, flushing, but Mary looked up with that smile that undid him every time. "We know," she said simply. He'd brought venison again, from a buck he'd taken down yesterday, as Sarah prepared it for smoking. Thomas found himself following Mary to the spring. It was their routine now, hauling water together, these moments of near privacy that felt stolen and precious. "I've been thinking," he said, as they knelt by the water's edge, breaking the thin ice with a stone. "Dangerous habit for a man," Mary teased. "About spring, when the snow melts—" He paused, gathering courage. "You could stay on my land. I mean, there's that old line shack on the eastern border. No one ever goes there. It would be safer than—" "Thomas," her voice was gentle but firm, "you know we can't." "Why not? I have 300 acres. Room enough to disappear." She sat back on her heels, looking at him with those dark eyes that seemed to see straight through him. "And when your neighbors ask questions, when men from town visit, when the army comes looking, I don't care what they—" "Yes, you do." She touched his face, her cold fingers paradoxically warming his skin. "You care because you're smart, because you know what would happen." He caught her hand, holding it against his cheek. These small touches had become their language, saying everything they couldn't voice aloud. "I care more about you, about keeping you safe. Safety isn't hiding on white man's land, pretending we don't exist. Safety is being invisible, moving like smoke." She pulled her hand away gently. "This is why Apache survive. We bend like grass in wind, not break like trees." They filled the water containers in silence, but as they walked back, Mary slipped her hand into his. Just for a moment, just long enough to say what words couldn't. That afternoon, as Thomas chopped wood and the sisters worked on preserving meat, the domestic peace felt so natural it hurt. This was what he'd been missing, not just a woman's presence, but partnership. The easy rhythm of shared work, the comfortable silences, the sudden laughter when Sarah told a story about Mary's childhood mishap with a skunk. "She smelled for weeks," Sarah said, grinning at her sister's mock outrage. "No boy would come near her. Our mother tried everything, sage smoke, river mud, even trader's soap. Is why I learned medicine plants," Mary added with dignity. "To never smell like skunk again." Thomas laughed, really laughed, the sound rusty but genuine. When was the last time he'd felt this light, this connected to life instead of just enduring it? As evening approached and he prepared to leave, Mary walked him to where he'd hidden Belle in a grove of pine trees. It had become their tradition, these farewells that grew longer each time. "Stay," she said suddenly. "Tonight, stay." Thomas's breath caught. "Mary, not for that." Color rose in her cheeks. "Just stay. Be here when sun rises. See morning with us?" He thought of his empty house, the cold bed, the silence that no longer felt like peace. Then he thought of Jim Henderson's warnings, of the danger he brought just by being here. "Your sister, Sarah says yes. We talked." The simple statement rocked him. They'd discussed it, planned it, wanted him to stay. Yes, of course, yes. That night was unlike the first. No storm drove him here, no desperation. He chose to be here, to sit by their fire, to share their food and stories. Sarah taught him a card game with stones and markings he couldn't quite follow, laughing when he lost spectacularly. "White men no good at Apache games," she said. "Too much thinking, not enough feeling. Story of my life." Thomas muttered, making them both laugh again. Later, as Sarah dozed by the fire, Mary and Thomas sat close, not quite touching but aware of every inch between them. She was teaching him to work with beads, his thick fingers clumsy with the tiny objects. "Why do you bother with me?" he asked suddenly. "I bring you danger, give you so little in return." Mary was quiet for so long he thought she wouldn't answer. Then, "You know the plant that grows after fire? First green in black earth?" He nodded. He'd seen it on the prairie after lightning strikes. "That's you," she said. "Everything burned away, but underneath, ready to grow. Just needed right conditions." "And you're the rain?" he asked, trying to follow the metaphor. She smiled. "We're the spring." "You're the one doing the growing." They talked until late, voices low to not wake Sarah. Mary told him about her childhood before the soldiers came, the buffalo hunts, the winter counts, the ceremonies she could barely remember. Thomas shared memories of his mother's garden, how she'd made beauty in the harsh landscape with stubborn determination. "She would have liked you," he said without thinking, then froze at his own words. But Mary just squeezed his hand. "I would have liked her. She raised good son." When they finally slept, it was on separate sides of the fire, proper and respectful. But Thomas had never felt closer to another human being. He woke once in the night to find Mary watching him, her face soft in the dying firelight. "Sleep," she whispered. "Safe here." And he was, for the first time in 5 years, truly safe. Dawn came too soon. Thomas woke to the smell of tea brewing and the sound of the sisters talking quietly in their language. When they saw he was awake, Mary switched to English. "Snow melting. Spring comes early this year." It was true. He could hear water dripping from the trees, see patches of earth showing through. The thought should have made him happy. Spring meant easier travel, better hunting, the start of calving season. Instead, dread pooled in his stomach. "You'll move on," he said. "Not a question." Sarah nodded. "When grass greens, north, maybe, or west, away from more settlers coming. I could—" "No," Sarah said firmly. "Your life is here, your ranch, your cattle, your future." "What future?" The words came out harsher than intended. "Working myself to death alone, talking to horses because there's no one else? That's not a future. That's just existing." Mary moved beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. Such a simple thing, but it steadied him. "3 moons we've known you," she said. "Short time, but—" She looked at her sister, seemed to draw courage. But sometimes heart knows quick what mind takes long to learn. Thomas turned to her, hope and fear warring in his chest. "What are you saying?" Sarah sighed, suddenly looking older than her years. "Young hearts, always making things complicated." But she was smiling as she said it. "We talked, Mary and me, about staying, about possibilities." "The line shack," Thomas said eagerly. "Like I said, it's far from the main house. Hidden, not hiding on your land." Sarah interrupted. "But maybe, near, there's good valley 2 miles north, water, shelter, game, close enough to visit." Mary finished softly. "To see where paths lead." Thomas felt something crack open in his chest, a sensation like ice breaking on a frozen river. "You'd stay? Really?" "Not for you," Sarah warned. "For us, because moving always, running always, is no life either. But if you're near," she shrugged, "makes it easier maybe." They spent the morning planning, discussing logistics with the same care they'd use for a military campaign. Where exactly to camp, how to stay hidden, what supplies they'd need. Thomas's mind raced with possibilities, with dreams that suddenly seemed less impossible. As he finally prepared to leave, he'd been gone too long already. Mary pulled him aside. "This changes things," she said seriously. "Makes it real, not just winter dream, but spring truth. You understand?" "I understand," he said. "I've never understood anything more clearly." She reached up, touched his face with both hands. "My white man," she said, mixing tenderness with teasing. "My nervous deer who learns to be brave. My teacher," he replied. "My spring after the fire." They stood that way for a moment, foreheads nearly touching, breathing the same air. Then Mary stepped back, proper again. But her eyes held promises that made his head spin. Riding home, Thomas felt drunk on possibility. They would stay. Not on his land, not under his protection like property, but near as equals, as, what, friends, family? Something more. The future, which had seemed so fixed and gray just months ago, now shimmered with potential. There would be challenges. He wasn't naive enough to think otherwise. But for the first time, those challenges seemed worth facing. His ranch came into view, but it no longer looked like a prison. It looked like half of something that might, with luck and courage and careful tending, become whole. The virgin rancher was learning that innocence lost could be replaced by something better, not the jadedness he'd feared, but wisdom. The wisdom to know that some risks were worth taking, that some connections were worth any price, that a life lived in fear of loss was no life at all. Spring was coming, and with it, a new chapter in a story he'd thought already written. Thomas Garrett, no longer alone, no longer frozen, rode toward his house with a heart full of dangerous hope. The saloon in Cedar Falls had seen better days, but it was still the gathering place for ranchers and cowboys from miles around. Thomas sat at a corner table, nursing a whiskey he didn't want, listening to the talk that flowed as freely as the liquor. He'd come to town for supplies, but old Sam's store was closed for a funeral, leaving him with time to kill. "Heard tell there's Apache bucks been seen up north," a voice said from the bar. "Army's gonna sweep through next week." Thomas's hand tightened on his glass, but he kept his face neutral. 3 weeks had passed since Mary and Sarah had moved to the Hidden Valley. 3 weeks of careful visits, of watching the landscape for signs of trouble, of happiness shadowed by constant fear. "About time," another man responded. "Bad enough we got to worry about cattle thieves without adding redskins to the mix." "Dobbs says he saw smoke up near Garrett's place." A third voice added. Thomas recognized Pete Henderson's drawl. "Says maybe our hermit ranchers got visitors he ain't talking about." The saloon seemed to shrink around Thomas. He forced himself to take a slow sip of whiskey, to show no reaction. Dobbs, he should have known that snake would cause trouble. "Thomas keeps to himself," Jim Henderson said from somewhere near the bar. "Always has. Man's got a right to privacy on his own land." "Sure, long as he ain't harboring fugitives," Pete countered. "You know what they do to white folks who help renegades?" The conversation drifted to other topics: cattle prices, the late spring, a new family moving in from Missouri. Thomas waited a reasonable time before finishing his drink and heading for the door. No one paid him much attention. The hermit rancher was barely more interesting than furniture. Outside, he forced himself to walk slowly to his horse, to mount casually, to ride out of town at an easy pace. But once he was out of sight, he spurred Belle hard toward the valley. He found them by the stream, Mary washing clothes while Sarah repaired a tear in their shelter, a clever lean-to built into a natural cave formation, nearly invisible unless you knew where to look. They looked up at his approach, Mary's smile fading as she saw his expression. "Trouble," he said without preamble. "Army's coming, next week, and Dobbs has been watching, talking in town about smoke near my place." Sarah stood slowly, her hand moving to the knife at her belt. "We knew this would come. You have to leave," Thomas said urgently. "Tonight. Head west into the mountains, or north to—" "No." Mary's quiet words stopped him mid-sentence. She rose from the stream, water dripping from her hands, her chin lifted with quiet defiance. "We run no more," she said. "Tired of running, tired of being smoke. Mary, please." Thomas dismounted, moving toward her. "This isn't about pride. It's about survival." "Is it?" Sarah asked. "Survive for what? To run forever? To never have home? Never have—" She gestured between Thomas and Mary. "Never have chance for life? Being alive is better than being dead," Thomas said harshly. "Is it?" Mary moved closer to him, her dark eyes fierce. "You lived 5 years dead inside. Was that better?" The words hit like a physical blow. Thomas reached for her, then stopped, hands hanging helpless. "That's different." "No, same thing. Body alive, spirit dead." She took his hands in hers, her grip surprisingly strong. "We choose, stay and fight, or run and die slowly." If you stay, they'll find you. They'll—" Thomas couldn't finish the sentence. The thought of what soldiers did to Apache women was too terrible. "Maybe," Sarah said. "Maybe not. We have week. Time to prepare." Prepare? Against the army? Thomas felt desperation rising. What can 3 people do against— "Not 3, Mary interrupted. "More. The Millers. They help." Thomas blinked. The Millers were his nearest neighbors to the east, an older couple who'd lost their son in the war. "They don't even know you exist." "Ruth Miller knows," Sarah said with a slight smile. "Found our tracks 2 weeks past. Came herself. No, men. We talked. She—" "What?" "Said she buried one son already for stupid war. Won't watch more die for stupid hate." Mary squeezed his hands. "There are others. Mrs. Chen at laundry. Jorge, the Mexican who sells horses. People who know what it means to be hated for how they born." Thomas sank onto a rock, mind reeling. He'd thought their secret was perfectly kept. Instead, a network of unlikely allies had formed without his knowledge. "How many know?" "Enough," Sarah said. "Not many, but enough. Question is, will you stand with us or tell us to run?" He looked at the 2 women who'd changed his life. Sarah, fierce and protective, hand never far from a weapon. Mary, gentle but steel-cored, looking at him with eyes that held love and challenge in equal measure. "You know I'll stand with you," he said quietly. "Always. But I'm scared. Scared of losing you." Mary knelt beside him, taking his face in her hands. "Fear is wise, but fear that stops living is poison. You taught us that. I think you taught me. We taught each other." They spent the rest of the day planning. The valley had good defensive positions. The cave could be held against a small force, and there were escape routes through the rocks if needed. Thomas would return to his ranch, maintain normal routines, be seen in town, if questioned. He knew nothing about any Apache in the area. "And if they come here?" he asked. "Then we fight," Sarah said simply. "But smart, not stupid. Apache way, strike and fade. Make them think twice about coming back." As evening approached, Thomas knew he had to leave, but something felt different this time. Final. Somehow. He pulled Mary aside while Sarah discreetly busied herself elsewhere. "If something happens," he began. "Nothing happens," she said firmly. "We survive. All of us. But if—" She silenced him with a kiss, their first, soft, sweet, tinged with desperation. When she pulled back, tears stood in her eyes. "Now you have reason to be careful," she whispered. "To come back." Thomas rode home in a daze, lips still tingling, heart hammering with love and terror in equal measure. The world had shifted again, become more precious and more fragile. He had something to lose now, something worth any fight. At his ranch, he tried to go about normal chores, but his mind kept racing. A week. They had a week to prepare for the army's sweep. It wasn't enough time. It would have to be. That night, unable to sleep, he cleaned his rifles, counted ammunition, tried to think strategically. His military experience was limited to hunting and the occasional predator defense. But he'd learned some things from Mary and Sarah these past months. Patience, observation, using the land itself as ally. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. Ruth Miller rode up to his house, a basket of fresh bread on her arm. She was a small woman, gray-haired and grandmotherly, but her eyes were sharp as flint. "Thought you might enjoy some baking," she said casually. "Bachelor like you probably doesn't eat proper." "Mrs. Miller," Thomas said carefully. "Thank you." She dismounted with surprising agility. "Let's not dance around it. Thomas, I know about your friends. They know I know. Question is, what are we going to do about this army business?" Relief and worry warred in his chest. "We? My Harold and I came west to be free," she said firmly. "Not to watch the same old hatreds play out with different faces. Those girls deserve a chance, same as anyone. The army won't see it that way. The army sees what it's told to see. Smoke from a cook fire becomes a war party. Two young women become a threat to civilization. She spat, an unexpectedly unladylike gesture. I've got thoughts on that. They talked for an hour, Ruth revealing a cunning Thomas hadn't expected. She'd already spoken to Jorge and Mrs. Chen. Plans were forming, misdirection, false reports of Apache signed to the west, away from the valley. Jorge knew cowboys who owed him favors, men who might be convinced to spread helpful rumors. It's not about fighting the army, Ruth explained. It's about making them look elsewhere, like a magic trick. Wave one hand while the other does the work. After she left, Thomas felt a tiny spark of hope. They weren't alone, in this hard land where differences could mean death. Some people still chose humanity over hate. The next days passed in a blur of preparation. Thomas visited the valley daily, bringing supplies and updates. More allies revealed themselves. A black farrier who knew about hiding in plain sight. A Jewish merchant who understood persecution. Even a young cavalry sergeant who'd seen too much violence against women and children to stomach more. Why? Mary asked one evening as they sat watching the sunset paint the rocks red. Why do they help us? Because, Thomas said slowly, understanding dawning. Everyone's fighting their own version of this battle. Against hate, against fear, against the idea that different means enemy. She leaned into him, warm and solid and real. Strange army we have, broken people fixing each other. The best kind of army, Sarah said from behind them. One that fights for something, not against. The night before the army's expected arrival, Thomas stayed in the valley. They didn't talk much, just sat together around the small fire, drawing strength from presence. Sarah cleaned her rifle with methodical care. Mary worked on a piece of beadwork, her fingers steady despite everything. Whatever happens tomorrow, Thomas said quietly, I want you to know. We know, Sarah interrupted. You love her. She loves you. I love you both for giving me hope. Now stop talking like we're already ghosts. Mary laughed, soft and surprised. Sister's right. Tomorrow we're clever. Day after, we're alive. Day after that. She looked at Thomas, eyes bright with dreams. Maybe we start building instead of hiding. Building what? He asked. Life, she said simply. Real life, not just surviving, but living together. The word hung in the air like a promise. Fragile as spring ice, but warm as summer sun. Together, despite everything, law, prejudice, danger. Together. Thomas pulled Mary close, Sarah on her other side, and they sat that way as stars emerged overhead. Tomorrow would bring what it brought, but tonight they had this connection, hope, the fierce determination to claim their right to exist, to love, to be. The virgin rancher had found his courage at last, not in isolation, not in hardness, but in the terrifying, wonderful risk of caring. Whatever tomorrow brought, he would face it as a man transformed, fighting not just for his own heart, but for the chance that all hearts might beat free. The fire crackled, sending sparks into the darkness. Somewhere, an owl called, and in a hidden valley in the Wyoming Territory, 3 souls prepared to make their stand. The attack came at dawn, but not from the army. Thomas woke to the sound of horses, too many horses, moving too fast. He rolled from his bedroll, grabbing his rifle as Mary and Sarah came instantly alert beside him. Through the pre-dawn gloom, he could see riders circling the valley entrance. 8, maybe 10 men. That's not the army, Sarah whispered, her voice tight with controlled fear. She was right. These men wore no uniforms, moved with the loose coordination of a mob rather than military precision. Thomas recognized the lead rider's yellow coat, even in the dim light. Dobbs, and beside him, Pete Henderson. Garrett, Dobbs' voice echoed off the canyon walls. We know you're in there with your squaws. Come out now, and maybe we let you live. Thomas felt Mary's hand on his arm, steadying. Sarah had already melted into the shadows, moving toward a defensive position they'd scouted days ago. Stay hidden, Thomas whispered to Mary, no matter what happens. But she shook her head, checking the load on her own rifle. We stand together or not at all. There was no time to argue. Thomas stepped into view, rifle held ready but not aimed. "This is private property. Dobbs, you're trespassing. Ain't your property, breed lover," Pete Henderson called out. "This is open range, and we're here to clean out the Apache trash." "Funny how brave you are with 10 men behind you." Thomas replied, "Where's your father? Pete? Does Jim know what you're doing?" That gave Pete pause, but Dobbs spurred his horse forward. "Old man Henderson's gone soft, but we haven't. Town's tired of worrying about renegades. We're ending it today. The only thing ending today is your welcome in this valley." Thomas said, "Turn around. Last warning." Dobbs laughed. An ugly sound. "You threatening us, Garrett? 1 man and 2 squaws against—" The shot came from the rocks above, so close to Dobbs's head that his hat flew off. Sarah's voice carried clear and cold. "1 man and 2 Apache women who know these rocks better than you know your own names. Next one won't miss." The riders milled nervously, suddenly aware of how exposed they were. The valley entrance was narrow, rocks on both sides perfect for ambush. What had seemed like easy prey now looked like a trap. "You fire on us. It's murder," one of the men called out. "We'll have the law on you." "Self-defense isn't murder," Ruth Miller's voice said from behind them. The riders spun to find the elderly woman on her horse, and she wasn't alone. Jorge sat beside her, along with Mrs. Chen's son David, the black farrier Samuel, and, surprisingly, Jim Henderson himself. "What the hell?" Pete sputtered. "Pa, what are you doing?" "Stopping you from doing something stupid," Jim said grimly. "Though looks like I'm too late for that. They're harboring fugitives," Dobbs protested. "It's our duty. Our duty is to mind our own business." Jim interrupted. "These women aren't bothering anyone. They're not stealing cattle or causing trouble. Only trouble here is what you brought." "You taking their side?" Pete looked genuinely shocked. "Against your own kind." Jim's weathered face hardened. "My kind includes decent folks trying to live in peace. Always has. Now get on home before someone gets hurt." For a moment, the scene balanced on a knife's edge. Thomas could see Dobbs calculating odds, weighing bloodlust against the reality of the situation. They'd expected to find Thomas alone with 2 helpless women. Instead, they faced armed defenders with the high ground and unexpected allies. Then one of the riders, Thomas didn't recognize him, made the mistake of going for his gun. Several things happened at once. Sarah's rifle cracked from above. The man cried out, clutching his shoulder as his pistol flew from his hand. Mary appeared beside Thomas, her own rifle trained on Dobbs. And from the rocks all around, more figures emerged. The young cavalry sergeant Thomas had met, 2 of Jorge's vaqueros, even the Jewish merchant with an ancient shotgun. "Enough!" Jim Henderson's voice boomed. "Dobbs, collect your man and get out. Pete, you're coming with me. Rest of you scatter before I have the sergeant here arrest the lot of you for attempted murder." The riders broke, most wheeling their horses and fleeing. Dobbs lingered, his face twisted with rage. "This ain't over. Garrett, you chose your side. Remember that." "I'll remember," Thomas said quietly. "Question is, will you remember that threatened women who defended themselves? Will you remember that good people stood against you? Will you remember anything besides your hate?" Dobbs spat, then spurred his horse after the others. Pete followed more slowly, but not before giving his father a look of betrayal that probably cut the old man deep. As the dust settled, Thomas found himself shaking. Not from fear, but from the realization of what had just happened. The community, his community, had stood for what was right. Not all of them, but enough. Enough to matter. Mary's hand slipped into his. "You see," she said softly. "Not alone, never alone." Sarah climbed down from her perch, moving with the easy grace of someone born to rough country. "They'll be back. Maybe not tomorrow, but eventually." "Maybe," Jim Henderson said, dismounting heavily. "But maybe not. Dobbs is a coward, and cowards need easy targets. You've shown you're anything but easy." He looked at Mary and Sarah directly for the first time. "I owe you ladies an apology. My boy's behavior. That's on me. I taught him to be proud. but somewhere that turned to mean, "I'll handle him. Your son makes his own choices." Sarah said, "But thank you for coming, for standing with us." Jim nodded awkwardly, clearly uncomfortable with the thanks. "Thomas is a good neighbor, keeps to himself, works hard. Man like that deserves to find happiness however it comes." The Allies dispersed after checking that everyone was unharmed. The wounded rider would survive, though he'd be favoring that shoulder for months. Ruth Miller pressed a basket of food into Mary's hands before leaving, whispering something that made her smile. Jorge's vaqueros touched their hat brims respectfully to the women before riding off. When they were alone again, the three of them stood in the morning light, processing what had happened. The attack they'd prepared for hadn't come, or rather, it had come from an unexpected direction and been turned aside by unexpected defenders. "The army will still come," Thomas said. "This doesn't change that." "No," Sarah agreed, "but it changes how we face it. Not as fugitives hiding in fear, as people with friends, with support, with rights." "We don't have rights," Mary said quietly. "Not in their law." "Then maybe it's time to make new law." Thomas said, the word surprised him, but felt right. Or at least bend the old ones until they fit better. They spent the day repairing what little damage had been done and improving their defenses. But the mood was different now, lighter somehow. Despite the morning's violence, they'd been tested and hadn't broken. More importantly, they hadn't faced the test alone. As evening fell, Thomas sat with Mary by the spring, watching the last light fade from the canyon walls. Sarah had discreetly made herself scarce, giving them privacy they rarely had. "I was proud of you today," Mary said. "You stood tall, spoke true." "I was terrified," Thomas admitted. "When I saw Dobbs, when I thought—" He stopped, unable to voice what he thought might happen. "Fear and courage aren't enemies," Mary said. "They're partners. Can't have one without the other." She leaned into him, and he wrapped his arm around her, marveling at how natural it felt now. This closeness that had once seemed impossible was now necessary as breathing. "What Jorge's man whispered to Sarah," Mary said after a while. "He said the army patrol went west, following false rumors of a war party near the mountains. Won't be here for days, maybe weeks." Relief flooded through Thomas. A reprieve. Time to plan better, to strengthen their network of allies, to maybe find a legal solution, or at least a sustainable one. "What are you thinking?" Mary asked, reading his thoughtfulness. "I'm thinking about the future, about building that life you talked about. Real life." He turned to face her. "Marry me?" The words hung in the air between them. Mary's eyes widened, but she didn't pull away. "Thomas, I know it's not legal. I know most people won't recognize it. But we could find someone, that traveling preacher who comes through, or maybe go north to the territories where things are different." He was babbling now, nervous as that first night. "I want to stand before God and whoever else will witness and say that you're my wife, that we're family, that—" She silenced him with a kiss, deeper than their first, full of promise and acceptance and joy. When they parted, tears streaked her face. "Yes," she whispered, "though Creator already knows what's in our hearts. But yes, we'll speak it for the world to hear." They sat by the spring until full dark, planning a different kind of future than either had imagined. It wouldn't be easy. Mixed marriages faced challenges beyond the legal: social ostracism, economic pressures, sometimes violence. But after today, Thomas believed they could face those challenges. They'd already begun building something larger than themselves, a community that judged by character rather than color. Sarah returned as they made their way back to camp, taking one look at their faces and smiling. "Finally," she said. "I thought I'd be old and gray before you two figured it out." "Will you stand with us?" Mary asked her sister. "When we speak our vows?" Sarah embraced them both, fierce and protective. "Try to stop me. Someone needs to make sure Thomas doesn't faint." They laughed, the sound echoing off the canyon walls. In the morning, there would be new plans to make, new challenges to face. The threat of Dobbs and his ilk hadn't vanished, just retreated. The army would still come eventually. The law still said Mary and Sarah shouldn't exist outside reservation boundaries. But tonight, in their hidden valley, with stars overhead and love acknowledged, none of that mattered. They'd fought for their right to exist as they chose, and they'd won the first battle. Not with violence, though they'd been prepared for that, but with something stronger: community, courage, and the radical act of refusing to hate in return. Thomas thought of his parents, of their fears and warnings. He hoped they would understand that he hadn't betrayed their memory, but honored it in a different way. They'd taught him to work hard, to be honest, to stand by his word. Now he was applying those lessons to something they couldn't have imagined: building a life with the woman he loved, regardless of what the world said about it. The fire burned low as they settled for sleep. Close together now, no longer pretending separateness. Tomorrow would bring what it brought, but tonight they were together, alive and free in all the ways that truly mattered. The virgin rancher had become something else entirely: a man willing to fight for love, a partner in an unlikely alliance, a bridge between worlds that were supposed to be separate. The transformation that had begun in a blizzard was complete, forged in the fire of conflict and cooled in the spring of hope. The day after Dobbs's failed attack, Thomas stood in his kitchen staring at the letter that had arrived with the morning post. His hands trembled slightly as he read it again. The Indian agent from the reservation was coming to investigate reports of renegade Apaches in the area. He would arrive within the week with a military escort. Thomas saddled Belle and rode hard for the valley. He found Mary and Sarah already packing their few belongings, having somehow sensed the change in the wind. "No," he said, dismounting before Belle had fully stopped. "We're not running, not anymore." Sarah paused in rolling blankets. "The agent comes? How did you—" "Never mind." He knew better than to question their instincts. "Yes, but we have another option." He pulled out a second letter, this one worn from reading. "It's from a lawyer in Denver. Jim Henderson knows him, says he's helped in unusual situations. He thinks there might be a way." Mary took the letter, reading slowly. Her English reading was still developing, but she grasped the meaning. "Adoption papers? If I legally adopt you both as sisters, you become part of my family, my responsibility. The agent can't take family members to the reservation against their will." He rushed on before they could protest. "I know it's not ideal. I know it's strange, adopting the woman I want to marry, but it could work. At least until we find something better." The sisters exchanged one of their long looks. Then Sarah said, "You would claim us as family? In law? In front of everyone?" "I already claim you as family in my heart." Thomas said simply, "This just makes it official." "People will talk," Mary said softly. "More than before. Say terrible things about you, about us. Let them talk. Words don't break bones. Sometimes they break spirits," Sarah observed. "Break opportunities. No one will buy your cattle. No one will sell you supplies." Thomas thought of Ruth Miller, of Jorge, of Jim Henderson. "Not no one. Enough will survive." They debated through the afternoon, but in the end, practicality won. The alternatives were separation or a life of constant flight. This strange legal fiction offered at least a chance at stability. 2 days later, they made the journey to Cedar Falls. Thomas had sent word ahead to the lawyer, who met them at the small courthouse. Mr. Josiah Blackwood was younger than Thomas expected, with keen eyes behind wire spectacles and the careful manner of someone who'd learned to navigate treacherous legal waters. "This is highly irregular," he said, reviewing the papers, "but not illegal. The law is silent on many matters regarding adoption and Indians. We'll use that silence." The proceeding was quick, witnessed by Ruth Miller and, surprisingly, Mrs. Chen, who had closed her laundry for the morning to attend. The judge, an elderly man named Horace Fairweather, looked deeply uncomfortable but couldn't find legal grounds to refuse. "Thomas Garrett," he said finally, "you understand that by signing these papers, you become legally and financially responsible for these women?" "I understand," Your Honor, and you, Mary and Sarah, you consent to this adoption? We consent, they said in unison. Then, by the power vested in me, Judge Fairweather signed with obvious reluctance. It's done. May God have mercy on all your souls. Outside the courthouse, a small crowd had gathered. News traveled fast in a town starved for gossip. Thomas heard the whispers, saw the stares, felt the weight of crossing an invisible line. But Mary's hand in his, Sarah's proud stance beside them, made it bearable. Well, Ruth Miller said loudly enough for all to hear, I'd best get home and bake a cake. Not every day a man gains two sisters. We'll celebrate proper-like. Her words broke some tension. A few people nodded or even smiled. Others turned away in disgust. The lines were being drawn, and everyone would have to choose a side. They returned to the ranch, their ranch now, legally, to find an unexpected visitor. The traveling preacher, Reverend Michael O'Brien, sat on the porch, his worn Bible in his lap. Heard there might be need of my services, he said, eyes twinkling. Something about vows needing speaking. Thomas looked at Mary in surprise. She smiled. Jorge sent word. Said if we were to be family, might as well do it proper. The ceremony took place at sunset in the valley where they'd made their stand. It wasn't legal. No marriage between white and Indian was. But it was real. Sarah stood as witness, along with Ruth and Harold Miller, Jorge and his wife Maria, Jim Henderson, and even young David Chen. Reverend O'Brien spoke words about love transcending human prejudice, about hearts that recognized each other across all barriers. Mary wore a dress that had been her mother's, decorated with beadwork that caught the dying light. Thomas had never seen anything more beautiful. Do you, Thomas, take Mary to be your wife before God and these witnesses, knowing the challenges ahead, choosing love over ease? I do. Do you, Mary, take Thomas to be your husband before God and these witnesses, bringing your strength to his, your wisdom to his learning? I do. Then by the power granted me by the Almighty, if not by the state of Wyoming, I pronounce you husband and wife in the eyes of heaven, what God has joined. Let no mere human law tear asunder. They kissed as the sun touched the horizon, and their small gathering cheered. It was dangerous, this public declaration, but it was also necessary. They were claiming their right to love, to family, to future. The celebration was simple, food shared, stories told, quiet music from Jorge's guitar, but Thomas felt the significance of it. This wasn't just a wedding, it was a community declaring itself, choosing compassion over convention. The next morning brought reality. At the general store, old Sam refused to serve Thomas. Nothing personal, he said, not meeting Thomas's eyes. But I got other customers to think of. Thomas expected anger to rise, but felt only sadness. I understand. Sam, you do what you must. He was turning to leave when David Chen stepped forward. His family had recently opened a small goods store. We would be honored to serve you, Mr. Garrett. My mother says anyone brave enough to choose love over fear deserves respect. It became the pattern. For every door that closed, another opened. The banker threatened to call in Thomas's loan until Jorge's cousin, who ran a smaller bank in the Mexican part of town, offered better terms. The cattle buyer from Cheyenne refused to deal with him, but Ruth Miller's nephew from Denver was happy to pay fair prices. 3 weeks after the wedding, the Indian agent arrived. Marcus Pendleton was a thin, nervous man who seemed genuinely surprised to find 2 Apache women living openly on a white man's ranch. This is most irregular, he kept saying, reviewing the adoption papers. Most irregular indeed, but legal. Mr. Blackwood insisted. He'd come from Denver for this meeting. These women are legal members of the Garrett family. You have no authority over them. They're still Indians, Pendleton protested. They belong on the reservation. They belong where they choose to belong, Thomas said firmly. They're free women and my legal sisters. Your sisters? Pendleton's tone made it clear what he thought of that fiction. And yet I hear one of them shares your bed. My wife shares my bed. Thomas corrected, as is proper and right. You can't be married to your sister. The adoption was a legal necessity. Mr. Blackwood interjected smoothly. It in no way prevents religious or common law marriage, which exists separate from state recognition. Pendleton sputtered, threatened, cajoled. But in the end, he had no legal ground to stand on. The adoption papers were valid, if unusual. He left with dire warnings about keeping a close watch, about consequences for harboring other renegades. But he left. That night, as they lay together in the bed Thomas had shared alone for so many years, Mary traced patterns on his chest. "We won," she said softly. For now, he agreed. "It's not over, may never be over. But we have this home, family, each other." She raised up to look at him. "Worth it?" He pulled her close, thinking of all he'd gained against what he'd lost. Some business, some fair-weather friends, some peace. But in exchange, love, purpose, community. A life rich with meaning instead of mere existence. "Worth everything," he said. Sarah had taken over the small foreman's cabin near the main house, giving them privacy while staying close. She'd already proven invaluable with the ranch work, her knowledge of horses especially useful. At dinner, the three of them would plan improvements, discuss dreams, build their strange but strong family. The seasons turned. Summer brought good grass and healthy calves. They sold to Jorge's cousin's contacts, making enough to pay debts and save besides. Mary started a garden, coaxing life from the stubborn soil with the same patience she'd used to coax Thomas from his shell. Not everything was peaceful. Dobbs made trouble where he could, spreading poisonous rumors, trying to turn other ranchers against them. Pete Henderson still wouldn't speak to his father. The town remained divided, with some businesses welcoming their money and others turning them away. But allies appeared in unexpected places. The young cavalry sergeant, discharged now and working as a surveyor, helped them file proper land claims for the valley, making it legally theirs. A group of Quaker families moving through decided to stay, attracted by what they called a community of conscience. Even some of the Mexican families who'd kept quiet for years began to speak up, emboldened by Thomas and Mary's example. One evening in late autumn, as they sat on the porch watching the sun paint the mountains gold, Sarah said, "I've been thinking about the school." "What school?" Thomas asked. "The one we'll build, for the children who don't fit in town schools. Indian children, Mexican children, black children. Children whose parents choose love over fear." Mary smiled. "You've been talking to Ruth Miller. She has ideas. And that Quaker woman, Mrs. Whitman, she was a teacher back east." Sarah's eyes held a light Thomas hadn't seen before. "We could do it, make something new." Thomas looked at his wife, his sister-in-law, his family. A year ago he'd been alone, frozen, existing rather than living. Now they were planning schools, building community, creating a future that wouldn't have been possible in the old life. "Why not?" he said. "We've already done the impossible. What's one more miracle?" They talked until the stars came out, planning and dreaming. The virgin rancher was long gone, replaced by a man who'd learned that strength wasn't in standing alone, but in standing together. The transformation that had begun on a desperate winter night was complete. But the story was far from over. In the morning, they would work and build and fight for their right to exist as they chose. But tonight, with Mary warm beside him, and Sarah's laughter drifting from her cabin, Thomas Garrett knew he was the richest man in Wyoming territory. Rich in all the ways that mattered. Wealthy beyond his wildest dreams in the currency of the heart. Spring arrived early that year, painting the Wyoming territory in shades of green and gold. Thomas stood on the hill overlooking his ranch, but it looked nothing like it had 2 years ago, where once there had been only the main house and barn. Now a small community had sprouted like wildflowers after rain. The school Sarah had dreamed of stood near the creek, its freshly painted walls bright in the morning sun. Children's voices carried on the wind. Apache, Mexican, black, white, all learning together under Mrs. Whitman's patient guidance. Sarah assisted her, teaching the children traditional skills alongside their letters and numbers. "You're wool gathering again," Mary said, appearing beside him. She carried their son on her hip, little James, named for Thomas's father but with his mother's dark eyes and quiet strength. At 8 months old, he was already showing signs of the determination that ran in both family lines. "Just thinking how much has changed," Thomas said, taking his son and lifting him high, making the baby gurgle with delight. "Sometimes I can barely remember that lonely man who stumbled into your shelter." "I remember him," Mary said softly, her hand finding his. "Frozen outside and inside, but underneath, waiting to thaw." She smiled. "Like the earth in spring." They walked back toward the house together, passing the new buildings that had risen over the past months. Jorge's nephew had opened a blacksmith shop, Mrs. Chen's expanded store now served 3 counties. The Quaker families had built neat homes along the creek, their industry and principles strengthening the community's foundation. But it hadn't all been smooth progress. Thomas's left arm still ached where Dobbs's bullet had caught him 6 months ago, a cowardly ambush that had nearly succeeded. Only Sarah's quick action and Doc Morrison's skill had saved him. Dobbs was serving time in the territorial prison now, but his poison lived on in those who couldn't accept change. "Letter came," Mary said as they reached the house. "From Denver." Thomas's stomach tightened. Letters from Denver usually meant legal troubles. But Mary was smiling as she handed him the envelope. He read quickly, then read again, hardly believing the words. "The territorial legislature. They've passed a law recognizing common law marriages regardless of race. Meaning what we have is legal now. Not just in God's eyes, but in the laws." He caught her up, spinning her and James in a circle. "You're my wife, officially. James is legitimate. No one can challenge that anymore." Sarah emerged from her cabin, drawn by their celebration. When they told her the news, she nodded with satisfaction. About time law caught up with what's right. That evening, they hosted a dinner for their closest allies. The table Thomas had once eaten at alone now groaned under the weight of food and surrounded by the laughter of friends. Ruth and Harold Miller, looking older but no less fierce. Jim Henderson, reconciled with Pete now and both working to heal old wounds. The Chens, the Quaker families. Jorge and Maria and their children. A toast. Jim Henderson raised his glass. "To Thomas and Mary Garrett, for showing us that courage isn't the absence of fear but moving forward despite it. To community," Ruth added, "built one heart at a time." As the evening wound on, stories were shared. The children played together in the yard, their laughter a music Thomas had never thought to hear on his land. He found himself on the porch with Reverend O'Brien, who'd stayed in the area to minister to their growing community. "You've built something remarkable here," the Reverend said, "a glimpse of what America could be." "We've built a target," Thomas corrected grimly. "Every day I wonder when the next attack will come." "Perhaps, but you've also built hope, and hope has a way of defending itself." As if to underscore his words, young David Chen approached with several other young men, a mix of races and backgrounds, all armed, all determined. "Mr. Garrett," David said formally, "we've been talking. We want to form a militia, a protective association for the valley. Make sure what happened with Dobbs doesn't happen again." Thomas felt a surge of emotion. These young men, raised in a world that taught them to distrust each other, choosing instead to stand together. "I'd be honored to have you watching over us," he said. The party lasted late, but finally, the guests departed. Thomas and Mary sat on the porch, James sleeping between them, watching stars emerge in the clear sky. Sarah had walked Mrs. Whitman home, the two women deep in discussion about curriculum for the coming term. "Do you ever regret it?" Mary asked quietly. "The life you could have had, simple, quiet, uncomplicated?" Thomas considered the question seriously. In another timeline, he might still be that lonely rancher, working his land in isolation, speaking to no one, feeling nothing deeply, safe in his fortress of solitude. That life was already dead, he said finally. I was just too frozen to realize it. You didn't complicate my life, you gave me life. Ayana, she said suddenly. What? My real name. I want James to know it. Want our children to know where they come from. Both sides. She looked at him with those deep eyes that still made his heart race. Is that okay? More than okay. Necessary. He kissed her forehead. Ayana, eternal blossom. It suits you better than Mary anyway. Mary served its purpose, she said. Kept me safe when safety mattered most. But here, now, with you, I can be who I really am. A coyote called in the distance, answered by another. The night sounds of the prairie surrounded them, familiar now. No longer threatening, but simply part of home. Sarah wants to travel. Mary, Ayana said, visit other communities like ours, learn how they're managing, share what we've learned. Dangerous for an Apache woman traveling alone. Not alone, Mrs. Whitman wants to go. And that young surveyor, William, has been making eyes at her. Thomas chuckled. He'd noticed that too. Sarah, for all her protests about not needing a man, seemed not entirely immune to William's quiet charm. Things are changing, he said. Slowly, but changing. Because people like you make them change. Stand up and say, this is wrong, until others listen. People like us, he corrected. They sat in comfortable silence, the night wrapping around them like a blanket. From inside came the sound of James stirring, making the small noises that preceded waking. Mary, he'd have to practice thinking of her as Ayana, moved to tend him. Thomas remained on the porch a moment longer, looking out over the valley that had become more than home. It had become hope. The virgin rancher who'd taken shelter with 2 Apache sisters was gone, transformed into something he'd never imagined possible. A husband, a father, a leader in an unlikely community. Tomorrow would bring its challenges. There were still those who hated what they'd built, who saw their mixed family and integrated community as a threat to the natural order. The law might recognize their marriage now, but laws could change. Hearts were harder to legislate. But tonight, with his wife singing softly to their son in a mix of English and Apache, with children of all colors learning together in their school, with neighbors who'd chosen bridges over walls, Thomas Garrett felt the truth of what they'd accomplished. They'd proven that change was possible, that love could overcome fear, that the human heart, given the chance, would choose connection over isolation almost every time. The stars wheeled overhead, indifferent to human struggles and triumphs, but below them, in a small valley in Wyoming territory, a different kind of story was being written. Not the typical Wild West tale of conquest and conflict, but something rarer, a story of coming together, of building rather than destroying, of love winning against all odds. As Thomas rose to join his family inside, he paused at the door. Somewhere out there, another lonely soul might be struggling through their own blizzard, looking for shelter. He hoped they'd find their own pair of Apache sisters, their own chance at transformation. The door closed softly behind him, but the light from within spilled out into the darkness, a beacon for any who had eyes to see and courage to approach. The virgin rancher's story had become something larger, a testament to the power of opening one's heart, even when everything you've been taught says to keep it closed. In the morning, the work would continue. The school would ring with children's voices. The forge would sound with hammer blows. The fields would need tending, the cattle watching, the community protecting. But all of that was tomorrow. Tonight, there was only this: a man and woman who'd found each other across impossible divides, their child sleeping between them, their chosen family around them, their future bright with possibility despite all the shadows that threatened. It had begun with shelter from a storm. It continued with the daily choice to see each other as human, to build rather than tear down, to hope rather than fear. The virgin rancher had learned the greatest lesson of all, that love wasn't weakness but the greatest strength. That opening your heart wasn't dangerous, but necessary. That sometimes the best way to save yourself was to save others first. The night deepened, peaceful and full of promise. And in a small house in Wyoming Territory, 3 hearts beat together. Proof that even in the hardest ground, love could take root and bloom eternal. Thank you for listening to this story of transformation and hope from the Wild West. If you enjoyed following Thomas, Mary, and Sarah's journey, I'd love to hear where in the world you're listening from. Please share in the comments below so we can connect across distances, just like the characters in our story. Don't forget to subscribe to the From Wild West channel for more tales of courage, love, and the human spirit triumphing against all odds. What did you think of Thomas's transformation? Share your thoughts below.